I am able to free from the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
What does it mean Messiah matters?
It means apart from him we can do nothing. It means he is the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeshua is the only way of salvation. He is everything. We have to have the Tanakh to know the Messiah.
But we have to have the Messiah to know the Tanakh. Without Messiah, we have nothing.
Basically, it's all about the Messiah. It's Thursday, September 6, 2018. This is Messiah Matters number 233, rather. My voice is here, but my mind is already on vacation. My name is Caleb Haig, and with me, the man that is considering a new career as a roofer, Rob Van Hoff. What up, Rob?
No. So Caleb's referring to a leak in our roof, and so I've been up and down on our roof trying to locate. This happened a couple of years ago where I had to tear out a bunch of shingles and try to find replacement shingles that matched, and then Baruch Hashem, we were able to fix that other leak. So this is a new thing. Haven't located exactly, but yesterday I was able to start filling some gaps that I think might potentially be the problem. But yeah, whoa. To those who do roofing professionally,
good on you.
Good on you. Yeah.
My dad took me roofing one time when I was maybe 11 years old. There was a church building or church offices that we tried to roof. Now, I didn't know what in the world I was doing. I was swinging a hammer. I was probably making more holes in the roof than I was patching up. But I remember it being extremely hot and it not being cool. That's my memory of roofing. And so I plan to never try to do it again. We got 5 people in the chat room right now, which is incredible since this is the official secret show. It's like a speakeasy, but only for Messiah Matters. You know, like nobody knows where it is or when it's going to happen. It just does.
It's like the rapture.
Right. I can tell already that Rob is in the chat room because he is not paying attention to the show already. That's okay, though. I don't know what we're interrupting on TorahResource Radio, but we just interrupted it.
So if you were in the middle of like kids' Torah time or something.
Yeah, exactly. I feel bad, but I figured people would want to hear it. It's the secret
And Gary
show.
Springer's at a conference in like Atlanta,
and he's our radio programmer, so who knows?
Hi Gary, if you're listening.
Yeah, if he's listening, he's probably freaking out because
it's 11:20.
We probably came in right in the middle, like my dad's lecture on Galatians. Somebody was waiting for for that.
Like,
no. All right. So before we get started, we should just say that Messiah Matters is brought to you by TorahResource. As always, find all sorts of great stuff at TorahResource, free and to pay for if you would like to. Also, this show, number 233, is brought to you by our producers, our associate and our executive producers. Thank you so much to them. And we're coming up to the end of this quarter. So if you would like to be an accredited associate or executive producer, then you can do so by going to TorahResource.com and finding the Messiah Matters page. And there's information there. And you basically pay for a producership for a whole quarter. So it's really a good deal. And you get a cup. We're making new graphics and everything for this. So it's going to be a good one. The winter quarter is going to be good. That rolls over on October 2nd, I believe. So, yeah, think about it. And, of course, our monthly supporters. We could not do this without you. We love you guys so much.
Imagine a world without the Messiah Matters.
My dad said to me, we were gonna send out some postcards to people at camp, like supporters when we were at camp, these little postcards from TorahResource Institute family camp, kind of a wish you were here or whatever. And my dad was like, do you really wish that they were here? Like, he was like, doesn't that sound a little bit, is that a little bit gimmicky? And I was like, no, I really wish that every single one of these supporters was here at family camp so I could meet them face to face
Right.
and shake their hands.
Well, that takes me back, Caleb. That reminds me of what we're cooking, what we're brewing is yeah, where we come to you.
Right. I want to meet these
And
people.
so we again keep this in prayer that that Adonai would give us wisdom and clarity and courage and provision, etc.
I forgot to tell you this, Rob, but while at camp, I was given pretty good guidance that Texas is the first place we need to come. And the reason why is because we already have the place to do it. Christy in the chat room, she's not in the chat room right now, but Christy offered her home, which sounds to be a very large home.
Yeah, she's in Arizona though, right? Or
I thought she was in Texas. Maybe you're right.
Christy's in Arizona,
That shows you how much I pay attention.
Phoenix area, but Texas. I think we've got friends in Texas also.
We got friends in Texas and Arizona. Done and done. Anyway, yeah, keep us in prayer for that. Okay, be a part of the conversation. Email us at wrong one. Just joking. Hang on. There you
So
go. Call our comment line 253-465-3205 or send us an email, see@TorahResource.com. Go ahead, Rob.
Is this gonna? So our show that we're doing right now?
Right.
Is this gonna play next Wednesday?
Well, on YouTube, it's playing right now, so people will be able to get it on demand anytime they want on YouTube. That's the nice thing about YouTube. This show will play on the radio next Wednesday. So,
all right.
Yes.
So let's cook. I think today we're just diving in, and we don't know how many shows we might do
on this
topic, right?
Jerusalem Council. Before we get to that, I have a couple other things though. First of all, for our supporters, I should let everyone know that I recorded a quick little teaching. It was very choppy. I'm not very good at reading. I did a little teaching on the festivals, the fall festivals. It's up in the Messiah Matters More section, and I made that. The new one is always going to be the blue button. Anything that's new is going to be blue. So if you go into the Messiah Matters More page and you find a blue button, it means it's new. It's the newest thing that we have up there. So that's there. And then also, Rob kept saying to me, have you gotten the new JBL, Journal of Biblical Literature, which is put out by the Society of Biblical Literature? And we get a couple of different journals here in the office. For those who don't know, Rob's actually over in Spokane, which is about 5 hours away from me. And so here in the office, we do get the JBL, and we also get the ETS jets and some other things. So finally, I tracked this down yesterday, found it in the office, and there's this article. It's 20 pages, 19 pages, by a gentleman named Jan Heilman. And Jan Heilman wrote a article called "A Meal in the Background of John 6:51 through 58." Now, for those who listen to this show on a regular basis, you know that I have been for the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, writing a thesis on the Eucharist. And to be honest with you, the more I study, the more I realize that this is going to take years. This isn't one and done. Since I'm not in school, like full time, writing a thesis is not something that I can do in like 6 months to a year, like a normal student. So this is, the research alone is very large.
There's nothing about you normal.
Thank you. That's true. So I started reading this article, and basically this guy took all of the arguments that I've tried to make in 75 pages that I've written already, and he has succinctly wrapped them up into about 20 pages. The first 5 pages. And I'm reading the first 5 pages and I'm saying, this is exactly what I've been trying to say, but he says it better and he says it more succinctly. Like, this is perfect, right? So what I do is I look for, he makes a reference to a book where he says, well, this has all been covered in this book. Well, it's by him. And come to find out, it's his PhD dissertation, I believe.
Cool.
And so I look that up. I find it, and I'm very excited to read it. Unfortunately, I don't read German, and the whole thing is in German. So that was disappointing. So then I go to now. What I'm doing here is I'm setting this up because this is really there's a point to all this. I go to the SBL site, Society of Biblical Literature, and I just happen to see if Jan, who is studying in Germany right now, is going to be at the Society of Biblical Literature. And guess what? He is. And he's going to be in the same. He's giving a lecture in the same session as Andrew McGowan. Andrew McGowan is a leading scholar in Greco-Roman meals as well, which is kind of the area that I'm in. So what do I do? Since his email address is right here in the JBL, I get online and I shoot Jan an email and say, "Hey, love to buy you dinner at the upcoming Denver SBL." And this morning I got in. Who do I have an email from? Good old Jan gave me his phone number. We're connected on WhatsApp.
He's like, I like steak.
Yeah, exactly.
like tilling.
But yeah, right. But here's the thing: is that this is exactly why SBL and the ETS and SBL annual meetings is so important.
Right. Well, you got to find the value, you target the value, and you connect with those like-minded people. Here's why: because there's going to be thousands and thousands of people there that have completely different worldviews.
Right.
That have completely different value systems, and so it's you have to be selective, right? And what I like about what you're doing, and I've tried to do the same thing, is to be as deliberate as possible,
right?
Because there's value to be found in connection with people who are working and concentrating on similar problems, similar interpretive issues, etc., similar texts, and part of good stewardship, I think, as our part, as what we do at TorahResource, is to be clear and targeted and try to build those connections and encourage people. It's because he's going to be encouraged by you just as much as you're benefiting.
So this was a
scholarship.
This was a turning point for me 2 years ago. It was almost 2 years ago. We were in Texas, and when Dr. Chris Tilling, who's been a real blessing in my life, just his writing alone. Not to mention his
sense of humor.
Oh man, he's so funny. But he's encouraging as well. Even though I'm not one of his students, he's
like, can you talk like that?
Exactly.
Like, if you're like,
can you say those words if you're a scholar?
Like, rub elbows with N.T. Wright, and like,
right. But we were at the Texas SBL in San Antonio. It was like the third day. It was like the last day or something.
November 2016.
Yeah,
coming on 2 years ago.
I asked him. I said, seen any good lectures? And his response just blew me away. He said, "No, I haven't seen any lectures yet. I haven't gone to any papers."
It's like day
three. Like, what are you doing? And he was, he said, "Well, I've been getting meals with people, sitting and chatting. I've been in the book display talking with people, And all of a sudden I realized that it is very important to see papers and be in lectures. But for someone like myself, with such a very specific focus of what I'm writing right now, it's just as important to go and make sure that you're connecting with the people who are writing the books.
In other words, it works. We have to make it work for us. Our team, our TorahResource team, we go to SBL and ETS. We are there to learn from papers. We're also there to make it to come away personally sharpened.
Right.
And so that means we have to make use of the networking opportunities, the book, what they call the conference.
You know what this does, though? You know what this article does? It shows me that I am totally inadequate in my research and my writing. This guy sums up in 5 pages what I've tried to sum up in the past 30 pages of my thesis.
No, but see,
and he's done it better than me.
Well, that's good. You benefit from that, though.
Oh, I know. I'm absolutely.
Now, imagine this: you'd already published your book, and then you find this, and you're like, "Oh man,
yeah, exactly.
He wrote this already." No, see, this is good. This is you expanding your bibliography, clarifying your argument, because the Lord is guiding you, and He's gonna sharpen you. So by the time you have it communicated, you've got a healthy. You're not just. Here's the thing about bibliography and citation. The goal is not to have an article that just has tons of footnotes just so we can look impressive or that we can look like we've read a lot. No, the, we only want to have footnotes that are valuable to us to
Right.
support, and sometimes to say, you know what, there's an alternative view on this. See, John Smith,
Right.
for an alternative reading, But for, in large, our footnotes are because we recognize the limits of our own individual capacities and our dependence on the larger conversation of scholarship.
Right.
And it's part of a conversation. And so, you know,
So
anyway,
let me go a little further for our now. Let's start moving into Acts, and there's a small group that I'm a part of, and some of the people said, "Hey, let's study the Book of Acts." And I thought, wow, I've never actually gone through Acts. It could be a real challenge. For multiple reasons. Number one, my dad has never written a commentary on Acts, and usually when I'm studying and whatnot, his commentaries are, some of the things that I always go to first. What does my dad say on this? So, then I kind of glean from him. I can see his bibliography, and I can go and kind of jump from there, right? So it would be very difficult not to be able to, for me personally, it would be a test of my research abilities to start in a different place, because my dad hasn't written on Acts. He has written on Acts, but it was back in the 80s when he was in the Christian church. And so I thought, yeah, okay, well that would be interesting and good. So I started doing my own study, and one of the first places that I started was in the ESV Study Bible, as I usually do. And the reason why is because the ESV Study Bible, if you have one, they're really helpful. They have usually, I don't know, maybe 8 pages before the book begins that talks about author, time, setting, where the theme of the book, all these kind of things. And so I thought, well, okay, a lot of the time I'll start there and just kind of, and it's usually a real brief overview. And one of the things that it said was that the Western text has 10% more. Now, I was blown away by that. Now, I'll talk about what that means here in a few minutes. But this is not the first time that I've encountered the Western text, because the Western text, which the only Greek Western text that we have, and I'm going to explain what I mean by Western text, is a codex that is signified by D, and it's called Codex Bezae. It was discovered by a man named Beza, and Beza was a theologian during the Reformation, a good theologian by the way. He was a very good theologian, and he rediscovered Beza, and that's why it's called Codex Bezae. Anyway, so I've already kind of dealt a little bit with this codex and some of the interesting things that pop up in this, and the reason why is because in Luke 22:19, the Western text actually leaves out the part where it says, "This is the blood of the covenant. Do this in remembrance of me." And that's what I'm writing my thesis on, this specific part. So I've had to actually interact with this. So a little bit about text traditions, and then I will kind of punt this off to you. Basically, we today have predominantly 3 main text traditions. We have the Augustinian tradition. The Augustinian tradition would be codexes like Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Ephraimi. These are the codices that Bibles like the ESV, the NASB, are based on. And so this is the text tradition that they're using to translate the Bible that you have in your hands. Predominantly, they're using what is called the Augustinian tradition. Some people also say things like the Eastern tradition, but Augustinian tradition is what we would deem this. Then you have the, what's it called? What's the second main tradition? KJV is based on the second tradition. Majority text, thank you.
MT.
So the majority text is usually later. It's a later text tradition. So we're talking about 10th century CE is when the majority text starts to. This is where all these texts are from, and this text tradition is where we get the KJV, and the New King James Version is where they use the majority text. And then you have the Western text, and the Western text is very not nearly as well known. And the reason why is because nobody really uses it, which is surprising. The interesting thing about the Western text is that we know that it's early. We know it's a very early tradition. And one of the reasons that we know that is because church fathers, early church fathers, 3rd century and beginning of 3rd century, quote this, they use quotes out of what would be considered the Western text. Now, we don't actually have a Western text until the late 4th to early 5th century, and that's Codex D, that's Codex Bezae. Codex Bezae is the only Western codex that has Greek. So this manuscript has Latin on one side and Greek on the other side. And so it's kind of side by side, Greek and Latin. David Parker, who's I would consider him the leading scholar in the West, in Codex Bezae today. He's, I think, very convincingly proven that the main scribe was of a Latin tradition. So he spoke Latin predominantly.
Meaning, right.
And
wrote.
Right.
So it's like someone who is trained to write and read Latin and copy Latin texts, and then they learned Greek secondarily. And Caleb, so is it true that they're able to tell by the way he wrote Greek, like the letter formation, that it wasn't native Greek?
Right. So
it'd be like someone reading me writing Hebrew. They're like, yeah, this guy, this guy didn't grow up writing Hebrew.
Right. And so actually David Parker takes 22 pages in the beginning of his book titled Codex Bezae. It's a very expensive book. It costs about $150. I interlibrary loaned it, and it is heady reading. I'm about 65 pages in, and he's talked about every single hand that's in the every corrector. And I think that there's a lot of them. So he talks about every single corrector. He talks about the space between lines. He talks about the space between letters. He talks about just all sorts of stuff. The fact that the first 3 lines of the main text of the beginning of a book are in blue ink, which is also predominantly of a Latin tradition. He talks about the angle of which the quill was cut. Will tell them kind of where this person was trained, all sorts of stuff. It's very interesting for someone like me who
call that paleography.
Right. And the paleography to me is very interesting. I think for any person who's not really into paleography, I can see how this would just be dead boring. He's saying things like on folio 152, we have the sigma that is 16th millimeters shorter than, this kind of thing. So,
hey, by the way, I found it at Cambridge University Press, paperback for $58. So
nice.
If you want to get, now again, that's not a hardback. So not maybe as built or not nice of physically a product, but it's a little more, it's still $60 is still steep, but for people who are into it.
So the Western text, one of the things that the Western text is kind of known for is either deletions in certain places or additions in other places. So as I said earlier, the Book of Acts in Codex Bezae, or Codex Bezae is not the only codex that we have of the Western text. There's multiple texts that we have, but they're not. But Codex Bezae is the only one that has Greek. It's a Latin tradition. In other words, the Western text comes out of a Latin tradition. So we have Latin texts. We have some other. I think we have Syriac. I could be wrong. Anyway, the point is that in Codex Bezae there's 10% more of the Book of Acts. Now, a lot of this is like, and then he stood up, and he prayed would be that, and he stood up and prayed, and he stood up would be like an addition. These are a lot of the kind of additions. And you can find online, the Western text of Acts, and they put in bold everywhere that the Western text adds something, which is really interesting. Now, there's deletions in different places, like I've referenced Luke 22:19b. Anyway, so why do I bring all this up? One of the reasons I bring this up is because I found this very interesting. Other people may not, but I found this very interesting. In Acts 15:19 through 21, and this is really the portion that we're going to be focusing on for the next, I don't know how long, the next, at least this episode, and I would say at least another episode. This is the Jerusalem Council, right? And I think many people are very familiar with this text. Basically, you have the Jerusalem Council, and just to give a little bit of background, the council's saying, what do we do with the Gentiles? Do the Gentiles have to be circumcised to gain salvation? Now, this might sound like a really obvious answer, right? Because Paul talks in Romans constantly about salvation by faith alone, yada, 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 all these kind of things. And so why would they think that somebody needed to be circumcised?
Right.
Well, this is actually, and I think Rob and I have talked enough about this that we can pretty much refer to other shows, but basically this term circumcision or circumcised, we believe this is a shorthand for saying a conversion process. Do you have to convert to whatever and I know convert would be a later maybe concept, but there's rituals that you have to go through to become one of us. And do you have to do that? Do you have to go through these rituals to become part of Israel?
Right.
I think would be a better way to say it.
Yeah,
and
we've talked about this quite
ahead.
a bit. And one thing that I've seen, and I see it in the Instone Brewer article that we have in the show notes, which I encourage everybody to read. It's about 10 years old. I think was it 09 or 07? Oh, yes.
Are you getting into Stone Brewer at this point?
Well, I just wanted to point out one thing is that he, among other places, they'll conflate Acts 15 verse 1 with Acts 15 verse 5. What they both touch on the verb to be circumcised, but they're often conflated as being the same voice, and they're actually two different voices. So the voice of Acts 15:1 is a group of Jews up in Antioch. The voice we read at Acts 15:5 are Pharisee believers in Jerusalem, and the language is very different, and so they can't be conflated so easily. So I don't know if since we're talking about Acts 15, do we want to go back to verse 1 and verse 5 and just point out some of the differences here?
Sure, absolutely. Let me pull it up here. I got my ESV, and I'm going to pull up a parallel text in Greek, just in case. Go for it, Rob.
So the Acts 15:1. So some men came down from Judea, that is to Antioch. So it means they actually went way up north. This is not Antioch in Turkey, right? Modern day Turkey. This is Antioch in Syria. So almost up to where Tarsus is, where Paul of Tarsus was born. Some men came down from Judea, began teaching the brethren. Now, the translations are usually going to say something like, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, I take this, the verb construction here, to be, now it's an aorist infinitive, but unless you are already circumcised. Unless you were, in other words.
So we should have put your paper in on. Rob's written on this before, and you can find it on the TorahResource site under articles. It's free. Keep going.
I'm sorry, it's not infinitive. It's a subjunctive, but it's now that I pulled up the Greek, it's still non-indicative mood. That's the important thing. Is a non-indicative mood. A lot
of people don't know what that means, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
The point is this: I read this that the message that brothers were hearing. So brothers were being taught. Brothers means legitimate believers in Yeshua. Okay. Right? We're being taught. Unless you were circumcised, I take it as past tense. Unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you are not able to be saved. In other words, they were, and I take this with what I call the eighth dayers, and we know that there are certain groups such as the Samaritan Torah.
Today we got flat earthers. Back then they had 8 dayers.
Yeah, exactly. The Book of Jubilees, and perhaps a couple other sources that there was at least one strain of Jewish sectarianism that were hardline, unless a male, a Jewish male, was circumcised on the eighth day, they were cut off from the covenant. They had no salvation. So in other words,
and they couldn't get back in either.
So if a father failed to circumcise their son on the eighth day, that would that would mean that that child was cut off and had no recourse, because this is also a no conversion. There's a strict division between Jews and Gentiles here.
So I wonder what they would have done with the fact that Moses' son, one of Moses' sons, is not circumcised when he goes back to Egypt, and his wife is the one who has to.
Well, not only that, what about all the Israelites that come in under Joshua that were born in the wilderness? There's men at least almost 40 years old, presumably, that had not been circumcised, and so because they went through the whole wilderness. So the point is this: is that there seems to have been a hard line, or we can understand it with the Samaritans, because the Samaritans rejected the subsequent history, and so they would challenge some of that. We don't know; they didn't preserve the Joshua or the Samuel traditions, but the idea is that we do know, at least from the Book of Jubilees, that this was an issue and possibly accepted even at Qumran. We don't know for sure, but we know the Jubilees is highly quoted at Qumran as legal kind of official scripture. So in any event, the chapter 15, verse 1 of Acts, why does this cause a debate? It causes a debate and no small dissension, it says, is because you had believers who thought, who trusted that they were saved, and Luke here calls them brothers, right? So they are legitimate believers in Yeshua. They're being told that they cannot be saved, and of course, the two ways of reading this is the traditional way is unless they do an additional work, so they're not saved unless they do an additional work, or what my reading is there is no option for salvation for them. Right. They've been lied to because you weren't. Unless you were circumcised according to custom of Moses, which is code word, I'm arguing, 8th day circumcision. Now, that we need to contrast that. It says there's such a dispute, they go to Jerusalem to talk to the elders. Meanwhile, they're preaching repentance among the Gentiles, right? And more Gentiles are believing. But they come and meet with the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, and it says some believers.
For those listening, he's in verse 4 at this point.
Yeah, and so by the time we get to verse 5, we've changed. Even though it's only 5 verses, we've changed serious. A lot of time has gone by. Do you know how long it takes to go, even if you're on a horseback, to go from Antioch up in Syria all the way to Jerusalem? We're talking a serious.
This is a journey.
Geographical shift has happened between verse 1 and verse 5.
Right.
Although in the narrative, it's just Luke's interest is just to tell us there was a dissension in Antioch, and so they went to Jerusalem.
Right.
So because the verses are so close to each other, it's easy to think it's the same idea. But when you think of the time involved, and then it tells us, he says, some believers who were part of the Pharisees rose up. This is in Jerusalem. So now you have a different voice, a different group of people. And what they suggest is something different. They just say, they don't say you're unable to be saved. They're not telling people they're unable to be saved. They're just saying for people who are believers, it is necessary for us to be circumcising them and to command them to keep the Torah of Moses. And this is a separate issue because the issue in verse 1 threatened to undermine whether someone was really saved or not, as it stood.
Right.
That's not at all what the believers of the Pharisees are saying. The believers of the Pharisees are accepting these brothers as believers. They're not saying they're not saved. What they're saying is there is additionally, we need to be circumcising them. What does that mean? That means we need to set up little mohel shops all around and make sure people run through our shops.
If you're not part, and we see this today, almost the exact same thing happening today, right? The Catholic Church, and we see it in Christianity too. The Catholic Church will tell you if you're not baptized in our church, into the Catholic tradition, you're not in. You're not part of the universal church. And you have the same thing with other denominations, right? If you're not part of, if you're not baptized into the Lutheran tradition, or if you're not part of this Messianic congregation, or then it's almost like you're not in. You know what I mean? Or let's reverse it. For, growing up, I remember this distinctly. Growing up, we had a family that lived across the street and down a couple of houses, and they were Catholics. And I remember, and I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but we constantly prayed that they would come to faith in Yeshua because they were Catholics. So, I mean, the thought is if you're not part of us in some way, shape, if you're not some way part of us, now I'm making very, very broad strokes here, obviously, but if you're not part of us, you're not in. Well, the same thing seems to be going on here in verse 5. If you're not part of our sect of Judaism, if you're not part of the Pharisees, no. Like, you need to become circumcised and be part of us. Is that, am I catching what you're laying down?
Well, let's look back at the language. It says definitely these are believers from among the Pharisees. So we know at this point there were at least two, because it's plural, Phariseon.
Right.
We know that there are groups, whether small or large at this point, Pharisees who are believers in Yeshua and have access to the Jerusalem leadership. Right, like James and Peter and etc. And we know Paul eventually is, by this point, Paul is obviously one of the Pharisees. But Paul would not be, he would be a Pharisee who's not going to agree with this group of Pharisees. So this is among some among the Pharisees. Not all the Jewish Pharisees who believed in Yeshua are necessarily taking this stance. So it's some of them. And they're saying it's necessary for us to be circumcising them and to order them to keep the law of Moses. So what that looks like, it would seem to be skewed to a Pharisaic interpretation, which isn't necessarily wrong in terms of, the calendar, feast days, etc., counting the Omer. But obviously, as we continue in Acts, we see that the Ruach HaKodesh is not with these Pharisees on this issue.
Yes. And
so what Luke gives us is in Acts 15, which is really kind of the middle of his whole epistle here, because it's the middle of, his middle of volume 2 here of Acts. Right. We have the Apostolic Council, and then it's reiterated, some of it is reiterated another halfway again towards the end in Acts 21. But so we're taking verse 1. There are people not believers, right? He doesn't tell us that the people described in verse 1 were believers.
Right.
He just says some certain ones came down. He just calls them certain ones. And there's a distancing there. Why does he call these certain ones came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers? Whereas in verse 5, he's saying believers among the Pharisees said. So these are not the same group of people, and They have different motivations. Just to reiterate, 15 verse 1 is talking about people who I say the reason Luke gives the distance, because they're not believers. These are people who are going around and they're bringing division, because they're telling Gentiles who believed in Yeshua that, no, I know you believed that you were saved. You have no salvation unless and that could be unless you would jump through these hoops, or unless you were actually circumcised on the 8th day. And that's my reading, but I acknowledge the other reading there. And then verse 5, though, we are told specifically by Luke, the same author, these were believers from among the Pharisees in Jerusalem. Completely different groups of people, completely different message. There's no message in 15:5 that even this small group of Pharisees suggesting this, that the salvation of these brothers was at risk or was somehow illegitimately sold to them. That what they're doing is saying, we must do this to them. We must circumcise them. Well, what would that look like? That would look like if, let's say, I'm one of these Pharisees that believed, and I'm one of these advocates, and Caleb, let's say you're one of these Gentiles who just came to faith. I would come to you and say, I have to circumcise you, right? I have to do this to you. It is necessary that I do this to you. And you make, well, in other words, I'm forcing a thing on you.
Right.
And that is why I think the Ruach HaKodesh, among other things that according to God's wisdom, says no. the terms of the Brit Hadashah, the terms of the covenant of new creation, is that God writes the Torah on the heart,
Right.
and it's the desire of the individual. Now, in other words, what I mean to say is, we are not to read verse 5 here, and then its consequent rejection of this minority Pharisaic opinion by the Ruach HaKodesh and the council to mean that a Gentile is never to be circumcised.
Right.
That's the reading that has come down, it seems, and it's become a majority view in Christian history. And it's almost like a rut in the highway. Your car kind of almost automatically goes there because we've been taught to think that way. And that we know that's not true. We know that's not true at the very least because in the very next chapter, Paul circumcises Timothy.
Right.
Right? Okay, so the idea is it's not compelled. The issue is clarified in Galatians, which I believe was already written before, and that's another issue. But chronologically, Paul had already been to Antioch and had written back to the Galatians. So what Paul talks about in Galatians 2, in my view, is not to be equated with what's going on here, even though some scholars equate Galatians 2 issue between Kepha and Paul with Acts 15. I don't accept that view, but that's a side issue. The point is compulsion.
So let's.
It is not to be compelled. Why? Because once a person forces somebody else to do something, it's no longer a work out of faith. It's not faith working through love. What it is, it's someone imposing hierarchy and forcing another person, and that is against what the terms of the Brit Hadashah.
Right. Okay. I agree with you. And so compulsion here is I think you're on the right place, on the right track here. Okay. So there's a lot of different we got about 15 minutes left. There's a lot of different places that we could go with this. Now we could move straight into Acts 15:19. The one thing that I wanted to highlight, and this is maybe a little bit of a rabbit trail. I was talking about the Western text and Codex Bezae and what the Western text says, as opposed to what, say, the Augustinian text or even the majority text says. So this is an older translation, so you can hear some of the some of the old English that goes along with it. But this is how the Western text. And I think that there's a break in the codex because they put in something.
It's not complete for some reason.
It's not complete. They put in and from what is strangled. Anyway, okay, I'll read this, and this is kind of interesting. So this is what the Western text says. Wherefore my judgment is that we trouble not them, I'm talking of which from among the Gentiles turn to God, but that we enjoin on them to abstain from the pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and then they add, because I think the codex is broken, and from what is strangled, and then this is in the text, and from blood. And now this is where the Western text deviates from the other two text traditions. The Western text puts in, and that whatsoever they would not should be done to them, ye do not to others. So it's a reversal of the golden rule. And what is really interesting about this is that this text tradition, the Western text tradition, is prior to the writing of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, is it the Mishnah that tells us that Hillel is the one who originally reversed the golden rule? Or is it later rabbinics?
You mean when you say reversed?
Yeah, don't do unto others as you wouldn't have them do unto you.
Yeah. Well, in the Bavli, he says that which is evil to you or that which is hateful to you, do not do to another.
And so we're talking Bavli, we're talking late, 6th, 7th century. And what we have here is 2nd century Christian literature that has already reversed the golden rule. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not advocating that this is necessarily the original text or not. All I'm highlighting is two things. First of all, that the Western text adds a 5th commandment to the Gentiles. Don't do to others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. So that's put into the Jerusalem Council in the Western text, which is very interesting to me. The second thing I'm highlighting is we have a Christian witness way before, 500 years before the Babylonian Talmud even could be purported to be written, that has this on the mouth of a Christian, quote unquote. I'm putting quote marks between Christian, let's say believer. And whereas Judaism then tries to reverse it and say, no, Jesus didn't say it first, Hillel said it reversed. He
Right.
makes it negative. Well, that's not the text tradition that we have. The text tradition is that this was on the mouths of believers, reversed before it was on the mouth of Hillel. I thought that was super interesting. And of course, the end of this passage is, for Moses from generation of old hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath, which is also something that people tend to neglect. So that's my main interest in Codex Bezae here for this week. So should we talk I don't think it's going to take us very long at all to talk about Instone Brewer's article. And I think we have enough time to fit it in here at the end. Should we talk a little bit about Instone Brewer's article?
Sure. And we could maybe even talk about it in another show too.
You can always tell when Rob's in the chat room because his answers are delayed. Okay. So Dr. Instone Brewer is a wonderful person. I've met him personally. I've interviewed him. He runs a significant amount of different projects right now. I believe he's still running the Trent Project. He's got his hands in a lot of different things. He's written extensively on multiple different things, including divorce in the ancient Near East, which is kind of one of his go-to books. A lot of people reference that book. And I'm not promoting. I disagree with Dr. Instone Brewer on several different things. We've talked about some of the things that we've disagreed with him on. However, he's a fantastic person and he's a good scholar in terms of, he's one of the leading. And wasn't he the head librarian for Cambridge, or was it Oxford? Anyway, the guy's credentials are through the roof. I mean, he's just a very, very lovely person to chat with, and I hope I get to see him and talk with him again soon. Anyway, back in 2009, and this was sent to us by one of our listeners. Back in 2009, he wrote an article, and let's see here. This is my bad. I forgot to pull up the article itself. Pardon me while I try to find this. Basically, what he's arguing. Well, do you want to take over here?
Okay. Well, yeah. Oh, I'm hearing a weird echo.
Uh-oh.
Is that on my end?
Are you still hearing it?
Check. Yeah, a little bit. I wonder why that's there. I'll just have to. Oh no, it's gone now. So we got this article from Jets, which someone shared, and I had never seen this article. So thank you for sharing it. Was it Derek?
No, it was Justin. Justin
Wolper. Yeah, thanks, Justin, for sharing this. I had not seen this article. So it's from 2009, Jets' Journal of Evangelical Theological Society.
Right.
It is, at this point, it says he was, a senior research fellow in rabbinics in the New Testament at Tyndale House in Cambridge. So, but it's called Infanticide, which is killing of newborns, which is a harsh topic, but that's what it is, infanticide, and the apostolic decree of Acts 15.
So
I'll just give a nutshell what he's talking about.
Yeah, well, hang on just a sec. We should just, we should just say very quickly that infanticide in the first century, they considered this abortion, because basically what would happen is the child would be born, and then if it was unwanted, they would then kill the child, either by smothering or strangulation, and then from there, they would leave it out in the wilderness for to be taken, and they called this was essentially what they considered abortion. The problem is that it wasn't abortion. The child was abortion's wrong anyway.
Murder. Abortion's murder, but it was the idea is that the baby had already been born. That's the difference, I guess, that we're pointing out here.
That is the difference, but not that one is morally different than the other, in my opinion.
Exactly.
However, the point is that obviously the child is born. You have a breathing, living human being, and what Instone Brewer points out is that even though this was certainly looked down upon in the Jewish culture and community, it still happened in the Jewish culture and community. People were still practicing infanticide in the first century among Jewish people within Israel. Okay, go ahead.
So what Instone Brewer wants to point out is, and so if you have a chance to read it, it's good, but be sure to read Tim Haig's work on the Noahide laws also. That's important. Because you'll see Instone Brewer rehearse some of the same points, recite some of the same texts with respect to how do we understand these four commandments or prohibitions that we things to avoid, things to guard from, that are given in the apostolic decree. And so Instone Brewer does a good job of rehearsing the various solutions that have been placed on it. But what he zeroes in on in this particular article is this word pnikdas, which is this word usually translated from things strangled. And what he observes is, wow, we can't, when we look, what does this word mean? So as a good lexicographer would do, I want to go and find other uses of the word. Well, sadly, we just don't have a lot of help. It's not used a whole bunch, and it's not used in the Septuagint. It doesn't seem to have much traction in Jewish Greek, at least in texts that survive.
Right.
And what he goes to show is that even in Greek literature, just in Greek Gentile literature, it's not entirely clear what it means. And so he argues, and he basically comes down to, it can mean one of two things. It can mean meat of an animal that has been choked, which is supposed to be then somehow tender, because and it's sad, but apparently that is something, maybe because of the blood in it or something. Or it actually means infanticide. And he says that it's the latter. He wants to argue that it means this word, if we call it abortion, even though it's different than what we would maybe define that to be today. And so he wants to argue that that's what it is.
Right.
And I completely disagree. I don't think that makes any sense. Not because that is an abomination and wicked sin in the eyes of the Lord.
Because it certainly is.
Because it certainly is. But rather, I don't think that that there makes any sense that people who are believers in Yeshua, who have the spirit of the Messiah in their hearts, whereby they cry, Abba, Father, where they would need to, that this sort of thing would be an area of ambiguity where they would need clarification.
So let me play devil's advocate here for just a second, because what I understand Instone Brewer to be saying is that you have Gentiles who are coming from a Roman culture. And I didn't read the entire article. I simply didn't have time. But I did read a good portion of it. And what I understand him saying is that in the Roman culture, it was more acceptable than in the Jewish culture. And this is essentially what you have in the Jerusalem Council anyway. Even if you're talking about idolatry, basically don't practice your idolatry in the synagogue because you're going to get kicked out, or within the community. And what I hear Instone Brewer saying is you have a culture from Rome that doesn't put as in fact, he even brings up the who was it, the emperor, or no, not the emperor. Anyway, he brings up somebody who is seen as like a moral hierarchy who practiced infanticide. And so if you're coming out of the Roman culture into a Jewish culture, this might be something that and if the Jewish culture looks down on it so strongly, maybe this is what, once again, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but maybe this is where the Jerusalem Council, I'll show my cards now. I actually agree with you. I think that this is more I think that the four prohibitions, 5 if you want to take the Western text, which I once again have not deemed to be the correct text, but we'll say for now the 4 prohibitions, I think that they are more akin to idolatry, and we can talk about that on a different show. But the point is that I think this is Instone Brewer's point. I think that's the point that he's trying to reach at.
Well, at the end, he basically tries. This is towards the end. He says there's two different possible ways to read the apostolic decree. One is a framework for how preparing food when eating with Jews,
right?
And the other is how to avoid immorality of the Gentile world. So he takes it that if it has to do with food, then the idol offerings, the blood, and then the strangling can fit with that. Whereas if it's training, if it's not about how to have fellowship with Jews in the synagogue, if it's rather about instructing them to avoid certain things in the Gentile immoral world, it has to do with blood. Then is like, don't kill,
right?
And avoid, protect yourself from blood or infanticide. And I think it's such a stretch. I'm glad he wrote the article. I guess I'm glad he wrote the article because but what he did is he shows, in my view, it's a dead end. In other words, the value of this article is not that I agree with him. The value of the article is that he chased down a possibility, and in my view, it's a dead end. There's no fruitful gain from his position. So even though he thinks there is, I mean, he thinks that he's staked a position that is contrary to the reading history, because I don't know of anybody who's ever suggested that that's what this word strangled means. And so there's a sense of innovation, and he got a published article out of it. But I think it absolutely has no traction.
So the problem that I have with the idea that this is infanticide is that, and once again, maybe I'm missing something. I tried to read his article quickly, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time, really diving into what he, into. I didn't follow his bibliography or anything like that to other places. So, but with that said, it seems to me that the idea that blood means murder. This to me is weak, because even within the Roman culture, the Romans aren't coming in as new believers into the synagogue. And, I'm just, I beat my child to death last night, and everybody's like, that's fine. It doesn't. It seems to me that there was still, even within the Roman culture, there was a moral code. You couldn't just go kill people,
Right.
And so it seems like these are almost unnecessary. It almost seems as though they would be unnecessary. Now, infanticide would be something that might be necessary. In other words, if you practice this and it's found out about you, then okay, you're going to get kicked out of the community. Fair enough. But if you look at the other things, well, if you kill somebody, not only are you going to be kicked out of the believing Jewish community, you're going to be arrested by Rome, depending on who you killed, right? I mean, capital punishment was a thing. You don't just get off. You can't just go around killing people. So it's almost like it almost seems like the weight of what is prescribed by the Jerusalem Council is things that are actually happening on more of a regular basis than killing people. Blood to be killing people, and even infanticide. While it happened, there's certainly evidence that it was happening. And I just don't know the numbers of how often it was happening. I don't think that there was just thousands of babies up in the hills being, killed in the left for the dogs to eat. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I honestly don't know the numbers. But it doesn't seem to me like that was something that everybody, every Roman house was, it's, we don't like this one. It looks weird. Let's take it out and kill it. That doesn't seem to me like what was going on. Now, once again, I could be wrong. I don't have the numbers. So, but I tend to think you're right that the idea of this, because it changes the whole narrative, right? In in 12. I'm sorry, in 20, rather. In 1520, he says, but, let's start in 19 and go through 20. He says, therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols. So it seems like this is what's setting up the rest of the text, right? And what I hear Instone Brewer's article doing is saying, okay, this is separate from the next things, and from sexual immorality, and from things that are strangled, and from blood. Whereas what I hear my father saying in his article on the Jerusalem Council, also in your show notes from yesterday, is that all of these things are connected to idolatry.
Yeah, that's why I think that the value of this article is to just get you into the sources.
Right.
I would encourage people, though, don't just read Instone Brewer's article. Also, take the time, if you're really wanting to get to the nuts and bolts of the issue, to read Tim Haig's. Actually, there's 2 articles by Tim Haig. One is a larger ETS paper, which I think it was given. Boy, it might be older than this article. In other words,
it was 2006. Are you talking about?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's very possible. I don't know that Instone Brewer heard your dad's paper, right? And thought, you know what?
Are you talking about the Noahide laws?
Yeah. So it's do the 7, go to heaven.
So that was.
And then there's one is.
That was the very first ETS I was ever at, Washington D.C. ETS.
Was that in D.C.?
And he was in a room that held maybe 25 people, and there was about 75 people that showed up.
Wow.
Anyway, okay, this has been a great discussion.
Anyway, but there's another article, but I don't remember where. It might be just on the Divine Invitation article where he gets into where he's contrasting the certain groups reading in the Messianic Jewish world of Acts 15
right.
and the Noahide laws, and he's contrasting that with actual historical demonstrable meaning. Because one of the things that we've seen in the larger Messianic Jewish movement is there are institutional groups that take Noahide laws as a given way to interpret Acts 15, and they're
right.
there's not in slim company. We know that we've seen major streamline evangelical Christians scholars.
Keener's commentary on Acts, which is now one of the largest,
and it's just it doesn't stick. They keep trying to use different kinds of glue to hold that sucker up, and it keeps falling down.
My dad saw Keener. I think this is in San Antonio as well. My dad saw Keener and and asked him how he interpreted Acts 15, and he said, "Well, I think it was a precursor to the Noahide laws." And my dad just looked at him and said, "Oh, you did it. You did the same thing everybody else did. You should have read my article." Anyway, okay, this has been a great conversation. We're going to pick this up in 2 weeks, and as I think most of the people watching this know, I'm going on vacation, and so we have another 2 weeks stint before we pick back up with the show. And when we pick back up, we're going to get back into this topic again of Acts 15. We'll look a little bit more at some of the specifics of this passage. So we did 2 shows in a row specifically to try to hold people over. We got new stuff in Messiah Matters More, and then of course all of our listeners, I'm sure, are going to be very busy with the fall festivals. Rosh Hashanah or Yom Teruah is coming up in just a couple of days, and then we have the 10 days of awe leading up into Yom Kippur, and we will be back the day after Yom Kippur, and so that should be a good time. Anyway, it's been a fun conversation, and I hope that it has benefited you, and that it will help you dive deeper into the Word of God. May your hearts all be turned to our Messiah Yeshua during this wonderful festival season, and may we glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua, the Messiah. Why? Well, because Messiah matters.